comprehension yesterday, and we're going to look at another one today. It's the same one, in fact. We did C, D, and E last time, and we're going to carry on. But I'm going to quickly remind you of the answers for C, D, and E, because I think it will help you remember that, firstly, pay a lot of attention to the first line and the last line of each paragraph. Because if you look at C, the first line, the myth of the scientific method is that it is inductive, first line. However, the starting point of induction is an impossible one, last line. This has got to be about induction, hasn't it? Or the inductive method, which is why explaining the inductive method is absolutely right for C. And then we did D. And D, I think we chose, hold on, I will show you. For D, we chose number 7, the role of hypotheses in scientific research. Yeah, and so why did we choose the role of hypotheses in scientific research? There are other ones about hypotheses, like the testing of hypotheses, and also deducing the consequences of hypotheses. And I'm going to show you firstly that D is certainly about hypotheses, because we've got this expectation is a hypothesis, yeah? So we're talking about the idea that there's no such thing as an unbiased observation. Every act of observation is a function of what we have seen or otherwise experienced in the past. So we always have some kind of expectation when we do an experiment. We always do. And this is what this is explaining, that this expectation is a hypothesis. And so hypotheses provide the initiative and incentive for the inquiry. And it's in light of the hypothesis, yeah, of the expectation, that some observations are held to be relevant, some irrelevant. One methodology is chosen, another discarded, or some experiments are conducted while others are not. And that's why this is certainly the role of hypotheses in scientific research. Notice that it actually mentions research right at the bottom. Yeah, where is your naive, pure and objective researcher now? So it's certainly about research, but it's about the role of the hypothesis in research. Yeah, the whole lot of this is about this expectation that we all have when we do an experiment, that always there's some kind of expectation, and that expectation is the hypothesis. So this is all about the role of hypothesis in scientific research. Look at things like all scientific work. We're clearly talking about scientific research here. Okay, and I think this sentence in particular is clearly about the role of the hypothesis in scientific research. Okay, let's come on to E. Now, E, we chose a different one about hypotheses. We chose the testing of hypotheses for E. So we just did the role of the hypothesis. Let's see how E differs. Now, I want to show you that immediately, first sentence must be tested. Look at that, hypotheses must be tested rigorously. And then let's look at the last sentence, and we get your hypothesis. You must proceed to a strictly logical and rigorous testing process, guys. Yeah, testing process. So clearly, E is the testing of hypotheses. I hope that's all clear. Yeah, and so what I'm trying to demonstrate is that focusing on the first line and the last line is a good thing to do, number one. And number two, do look for synonymous terms from the title in the text. They will try to mislead you sometimes, I'm sure they will, but do look for test if you're checking to see if the testing of the hypothesis will be correct. And of course it is correct, and partially because there's at least twice they've mentioned test in that paragraph. Okay, so let's go on to F. We didn't do F last time, so this is new. So don't worry if you have some idea of what your results will tell you before you even begin to collect data. So that's talking about, don't worry if you anticipate the results before data is collected. Yeah, it starts by saying that. Don't worry if you anticipate the results before data is collected. Don't worry if you have some idea, some expectation, some hypothesis of what your results will be before you even collect the data. So it's looking good for that one. And let's have a look towards the bottom. Well, the whole text, in fact, there are no scientists that do this. All scientists have an hypothesis. No scientist has no expectation. All scientists have some kind of hypothesis, some kind of expectation. The only time when this is not the case is when there's an accident, and the writer then gives an example of the accident, like when Alexander Fleming left penicillin near the bacterial Petri dish. I'm not sure about the story, but I'm sure this is what the writer's referring to. So that was an accident. Alexander Fleming accidentally found this out, but he still had to formulate a hypothesis that penicillin is effective against bacteria to be tested before being sure that, it will fight bacterial infection. Okay, so the whole lot of F seems to be anticipating results before data is collected, because it even finishes on that story about Alexander Fleming where it was an accident. But even with an accident like that, he had to create a hypothesis to anticipate results before he did the experiment, before he did the new experiment to prove that penicillin certainly does fight off bacterial infection. Okay, so that's D for 5 for D, and then we're left with the last one, which is G. The myth of scientific method is not only that it is inductive, but also that the hypothetico-deductive method proceeds in a step-by-step inevitable fashion. Do notice the parallel structure. Not only that, but also that the hypothetical deductive method describes the logical approach to much research work. Yeah, let's have a look down here, because I want to show you that this is correct, how research is done and how research is reported. Now, please notice that G immediately starts by mentioning research. Well, down here, not immediately, the second sentence, where we get the hypothetico-deductive method describes the logical approach to much research work. So how research is done, guys, yeah? And it's saying research is done not by the inductive method, but by the hypothetico-deductive method. And I think it's absolutely right that most people think science is inductive. It really is a widespread misunderstanding of science when actually it's hypothetico-deductive. Okay, but it does not describe the psychological behavior that brings it about. So in reality, coming up with a hypothesis involves guesses, reworkings, corrections, blind alleys, and inspiration. And so we're still talking about how research work is carried out. Yeah, just coming down to here, how research is done and how research is reported. We find this in the second part, yeah? These have been quite properly organized into a more serial logical order so that the worth of the output may be evaluated independently of the behavioral processes by which it was obtained. So here we're starting to talk about how the hypothetico-deductive method is used to evaluate we use this to evaluate the experiment, but we don't include the behavioral processes like inspiration, which can't be included for how you came up with the hypothesis. And now we go on to how it's reported, because look at this. It is a difference, for example, between the academic papers with which Crick and Watson demonstrated the structure of the DNA molecule and the fascinating book, The Double Helix, in which Watson described how they did it. From this point of view, scientific method may be more usefully thought as a way of writing up research. Yeah, definitely about research and how research is reported, rather than as a way of carrying out research. Now, personally, I didn't like that last line in terms of what it's arguing. I disagree. But I can see that this means that G certainly must be how research is done and how research is reported, because the first part is how research is done and the second part is how research is reported. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Let's go on to the next question of the IELTS. That's all of the paragraphs done, which is questions 34 and 35. In which two paragraphs does the writer give advice? So we've got to choose two paragraphs where the writer gives advice. Now, firstly, the first paragraph, hypotheses are imaginative. There's no advice there. He was arguing in favor of the position taken by Karl Popper. I think it's a very good position. What Karl Popper said, he's right, that the nature of scientific method is hypothetico-deductive. So there's no advice there. Have a look at the next one, though. It is essential that you, okay, so he's talking to you. Sounds like he's maybe even going to give you some tip or piece of advice. It is essential that you, as a researcher, understand the difference between hypothetico-deductive and inductive research, so that you do not become discouraged or begin to suffer from a feeling of cheating or not going about it the right way. He's clearly giving you advice here. So B is one of our paragraphs where he gives advice. It's one of the answers. Let's keep going and look for the other paragraph. So the myth of the scientific method is that it is inductive. That's a statement. That's not advice. The myth is that from a disorderly array, blah, 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 an orderly theory will emerge. That's not advice. This is just he's just making points, isn't he? I can't see any advice in C on a speed read. There is no such thing as an unbiased observation. He's not talking to you, notice. He's not giving you advice. Really, he's got to talk to you if he's going to give you advice. And you can see that this is a rhetorical question. It's not advice. Notice I'm trying to focus on the first bit and the last bit. Let's have a look at E. Hypotheses arise by guesswork or by inspiration, but having been formulated, still he's not mentioning you. Okay, here's a you, so let's have a look. If the predictions you make as a result of deducing certain consequences from your hypotheses are not shown to be correct, then you discard or modify your hypothesis. Now, you might think that that's advice, but it's not when you examine it more carefully, because here, this is a zero conditional statement, because it's always the case that if the predictions you make are not shown to be correct, then you discard. Not you should discard or you ought to discard. This is just the hypothetico-deductive method, that if the predictions you make are not true, then your theory is incorrect. Yeah, that's not advice. It's just a statement of fact. It's a description of the hypothetico-deductive method. So if the predictions turn out to be correct, then your hypothesis has been supported. So he's not giving advice again. He's describing the hypothetico-deductive method. Once you have arrived at your hypothesis, which is a product of your imagination, you then proceed to a strictly logical and rigorous process. So this is just describing hypothetico-deductive method. It is not giving you advice for how to do an experiment. Let's go on to F, which straight away mentions you as well. So this might be good. So don't worry if you have some idea of what your results will tell you before you even begin to collect data. So that does sound like advice. Yeah, it sounds like don't worry. If you've got some anticipation of the results, that you're like every other scientist. So chill out, relax, don't worry. It's some kind of advice. Yeah, it's saying that you are following the correct method if you have some anticipation of the results. And so please don't worry. So here again, but even the researcher has to formulate a hypothesis before being sure that. So here he is giving advice. I would say it's mainly in this first line though. Don't worry if you have some idea of what your results will tell you. So we want B and F for where the writer is giving advice. B was very, very clear, but F is also where the writer is giving advice, and it's right here. Don't worry if you have some idea of the results. Okay, let's keep going on to the next question. How many minutes are we on this? 13. Let's see if we can get it finished. Do the following statements reflect the opinions of the writer? Okay, so we've got to choose between yes, no, and not given. So we just got to decide, does it say that Popper says that the scientific method is hypothetico-deductive? And we've got to either say yes, no, or not given. So it either mentions it, in which case we choose yes or no, or it doesn't mention it, in which case we choose not given. But I think I can remember the name Karl Popper coming up right at the start of the text. So let's quickly reread that part. He was arguing in favor of the position taken by Karl Popper. What is Karl Popper's position? That the nature of the scientific method is hypothetico-deductive. So I think for this one, we can put a big fat yes. Popper certainly does say that the scientific method is hypothetico-deductive according to the writer. So this, we've got to put yes. The opinion of the writer is that Popper says the scientific method is hypothetico-deductive. That is clear. So 36, yes. 37, if a prediction based on a hypothesis is fulfilled, then the hypothesis is confirmed as true. Now, be careful here. And I think if you know a little bit about the scientific method, you might already feel that this is not the case. Let's compare it with the sentence which is very similar from the text, which is, where is it? I think it's here. If the predictions you make as a result of deducing certain consequences from your hypothesis are not shown to be correct, then you discard or modify the hypothesis. If the predictions turn out to be correct, then your hypothesis has been supported. It doesn't say your hypothesis is true. It says your hypothesis has been supported for the meanwhile and may be retained until such time as further test shows it not to be correct. So it doesn't mean that it's true. If your predictions turn out to be correct, it doesn't mean your hypothesis is true. It doesn't mean that your hypothesis is a well-established fact, because it's not. It's not even a fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. Yeah, it's not a fact. I know lots of people out there may think that that's a scientific fact, but it's not a fact. And actually, facts have no place in science, according to Karl Popper. It's actually something that's a hypothesis. We all expect the sun to rise tomorrow morning, but for all we know, the sun might explode in a supernova explosion or something like that for reasons that I have no comprehension of. And for that reason, it's just a hypothesis. It's not a fact. And so the answer here is no. Certainly not. No. If a prediction based on a hypothesis is fulfilled, then the hypothesis is supported and can be kept and maintained, but it's not confirmed as true because it may be absolutely false. Yeah. And this is, the way that science works. So a big no for 37. That's not correct. You only can disprove a hypothesis. You can never prove a hypothesis to be true. You can only disprove hypothesis. That's what science is. Okay, many people carry out research in a mistaken way. So we need to search carefully for this. Many people carry out research in a mistaken way. So what we have to find here, if that's the case, is somewhere where he says that many researchers use the inductive method, and the inductive method is mistaken. But does he actually say that? Here he talks about the inductive method and that the myth of scientific method is that it is inductive. But as far as I can see, commonly referred to as facts, there is his criticism of facts. The myth is that from a disorderly array of factual information, an orderly relevant theory will somehow emerge. So here, as far as I can see, when he doesn't mention that somebody's making a mistake, that researchers are making a mistake. And that's what we've got to find. Now, if we look down in D, nothing about researchers making mistakes. There's a rhetorical question involving a researcher, but nothing about them making mistakes. E, again, nothing about researchers making mistakes. F, I can't see anything there about researchers making mistakes. Quite the opposite. In fact, it's saying that if you've got anticipation of the results, then you're doing everything right. And nothing here about researchers making mistakes. So here we're going to have to put not given for this one. Yeah, it doesn't seem to say that many people carry out research in a mistaken way. It does say that many people mistakenly believe that the scientific method is inductive. It does say that, but it doesn't say that many people carry out research in a mistaken way. I think he understands that most scientists do follow the scientific method correctly and use the hypothetico-deductive method. Okay, the scientific method is more a way of describing research than a way of doing it. Now, this refers to the last line. You might even hear it in there. Here, scientific method, from this point of view, scientific method may be more usefully thought of as a way of writing up research rather than as a way of carrying it out. I like the parallel structure. So it sounds very much like 39, doesn't it? The scientific method is more a way of writing up research than a way of carrying out research. That's exactly what is written in line. So definitely we need a yes for 39. Okay, so 39, yes, certainly. Even though I disagree with it as a point of view, it certainly is what's said in the text. Okay, and number 40. Which of the following statements best describes the writer's main purpose in reading passage 3? So to advise PhD students not to cheat while carrying out research. I didn't hear much about cheating in there, and clearly it wasn't about cheating. To encourage PhD students to work by guesswork and inspiration. Well, even though he says there's a lot of guesswork and inspiration involved in the hypothetico-deductive method, it's not the only thing involved, and clearly he's not encouraging people in this essay to guess their way to the correct answers. To explain to PhD students the logic which the scientific research paper follows. It looks okay on the surface, this one, but what bothers me is the word paper. I think it is explaining to PhD students the logic of scientific research, yes, but the logic which the scientific research paper follows, I don't like it. Not paper, not with that paper in there. It's not about the logic that scientific research papers follow. It's actually mostly about the hypothetico-deductive method. And so I agree it's about the logic of scientific research, but not scientific research papers. Then we look at D, to help PhD students by explaining different conceptions, the inductive method, the hypothetico-deductive method, of the research process. Yeah, and one of those conceptions is mythical, it's incorrect. Yeah, and the other conception is correct. Well, yeah, this is what's going on here. So let's choose D for question number 40. Now, I hope you've all enjoyed that. That's a little, I just wanted to go through my understanding, my logic when I look at a paper like this and see if it could help you and maybe give you a couple of tips, like looking at the first line and the last line. I think that will really help, and looking for synonymous terms. I think that really helps as well. So please, I hope you all go out there and do well in your IELTS exams. I know that if you get 38, 39 or 40, you've already got band 9 on this one, if memory serves. And so I know people do get it on the reading. I think that it can be done. There is a logical way of answering all these questions, and if you practice a lot on various sites online, there's loads of IELTS reading comprehensions online. If you practice a lot, then you will get a better mark. Okay, and if anyone's interested in IELTS classes, and of course I do give out these classes as well, and we do lots of exam practice, and certainly we do a lot of writing practice as well, because in my experience it's the writing part that people usually struggle with in IELTS, FCE, CAE, CPE. Okay, so thanks everybody for watching. Please stick around, and I might be back a bit later, and I hope to see you all soon.